And then I'm also working with Dr. Karen Daly and Zachary Valdez on a study to understand the experiences of academic librarians, both in the US and Canada, at diversity, equity, and inclusion, those professional development events, and the effects of attending those events on participants' attitudes and their work-related practices. So we had a survey and we're looking at the data right now, and we are hoping to publish something in the next year.
Thank you, Norda. Now on to David.
Hey everybody. I want to start by offering gratitude to Melissa, Reba, David, and to my fellow panelists, and to all the other folks whose labor has made this event possible. You know, I think gathering like this for critical conversations and connecting like this is important. It's never been more important, I think. And I really appreciate the work of gathering that the organizers have undertaken at a time when a lot of us are feeling sort of worn down by life under a pandemic and by all the sort of structures of exploitation and dispossession have been sort of exacerbated through official responses. Following the other panelists, I also want to recognize that I'm speaking today from the territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Attawandaron or neutral peoples, and the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically in the Mississaugas of the Credit. As I understand it, this is a territory that's also home to people from many nations, and one that is part of Treaty 3 of the Upper Canada Treaties, otherwise known as the Between the Lakes Purchase. I'm also very much an early learner on these matters, but my understanding is also that there's some questions about the intentions and process through which the Upper Canada Treaties have been acted on by the settler state. But what's not in question is that they've been part of a process across what's now known as Canada of settler colonialism and genocide, such that when we think of the land we're on, we're thinking of it as a site, you know, among other things, from which ongoing internal and external colonial projects are launched and extended. And we're recognizing that these projects are animated through familiar, if not homogenous racialized narratives, even as the violence of these projects is kind of erased in dominant accounts of history. And about an hour south of where I'm located, an all too familiar scene has continued to play out as the Six Nations land defenders at 1492 Landback Lane Reclamation Camp are continuing to sort of fight illegal housing development projects backed up by police repression and court repression. And I think it's worth thinking about what direct and meaningful support of this kind of land defense, which is about all of our futures, even if it plays out differentially among us, what this kind of support, what support of this kind of land defense might look like from within our world as library workers. So my own creative and scholarly work is primarily concerned with race, racism, and anti-racism. And I'm especially interested in the ways that these phenomena have come to be conceptualized both historically and in the present day. So what kinds of stories and assumptions are people working with, consciously or not, about what race is, about what racism is, and about what anti-racism is? What kinds of interests are served by the dominance of certain definitions of racism, anti-racism, and race? And what can the practice of sort of critically attending to the ways that these foundational concepts are defined, right? What can attending to those definitions tell us about the operations of structures of racist violence in the first place? And I mostly explore these kind of questions in the context of library and information studies, usually with Black diasporic life, colonialism, and capitalism as key frames of reference, you know, with whatever level of success, but that's kind of what I try to do. Some of the scholarly work through which I've tried to explore these kinds of questions include an article that critiques the logics of diversity and inclusion in LIS, and a book chapter that critiques the racial politics of the kind of overwhelming emphasis on practicality that exists within our field. And my most recent piece of writing is an article in Uproot that's really an attempt to make sense of the pessimism that I, and it would seem many others, felt in response to the sort of surge of statements and other forms of apparent institutional interest in Black freedom struggles, right? This surge of institutional attention in the context of the uprisings of this past summer. It's really hard to miss the surge of attention, and perhaps just as hard, I think, to miss the intensified emphasis on information sharing and study as an anti-racist response, and the attendant circulation, the frenzied circulation of these anti-racist reading lists that accompanied that attention. So the article looks at the dynamics of and the historical backdrop to that kind of institutional attention. And it looks specifically at what that institutional interest in anti-racism, and more specifically, what the makeup of those reading lists, what those things can tell us about how anti-racism has come to operate within and be integrated into racial capitalism. So that's the kind of stuff I work on. And I really think it's important. I'm super grateful that we're able to gather to ask these kinds of questions of one another. You know, even if part of the learning that follows is a result of thinking about the assumptions and framings that underpin our questions to begin with. So that's the kind of work I'm interested in. I'm really looking forward to chatting with everybody today and thinking together.
Great, thank you, David. And Maha, the same question to you.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who's making this happen today. I'm coming to you from Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. It's Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. I pay my respects to everybody who came before me and reaffirm my relationship with First Nations and Métis ancestors. I am a first-generation immigrant from India, and I've lived in various parts of Canada, but mostly Saskatoon for the last 26 years. My EDI perspectives in librarianship, the only degree that I took in Canada, are largely shaped by my first-generation immigrant experiences and librarianship experiences. I've been working in libraries since 1995, but only became a Canadian librarian in 2005 and an academic librarian in 2010. So I'm fairly new to the game. I'm also a fairly new settler. When I graduated from UBC in 2005, I took very basic research courses because I didn't see myself as a scholar or a researcher. But then I found myself working on EDI even before moving into academia while still at the public library here in Saskatoon, because there were many changes at the provincial level for immigrants to enter Saskatchewan. And suddenly there were numerous immigrants, particularly from countries like India, Bangladesh, China, and many other parts of Asia and Africa. In fact, the number of European immigrants was kind of dwindling. Some of these immigrants were coming to the library asking many questions about jobs and collections and services, and their questions and their needs got me to think about how public libraries are situated to help them. So I collaborated with a colleague and published a paper on the challenges of reaching these diverse populations. Although the work happened almost over 2 years, it was published just in 2010 as I was moving into academia. In my new institution, the University of Saskatchewan, where librarians have to publish or perish, I continued to work in the area that I had already started, which I called at the time as multiculturalism or diversity in libraries. As I was trying to settle into my new position and work towards tenure, I realized all the gaps in EDI work in libraries or librarianship and was slowly starting to unpack them. When I realized there was no data on BIPOC librarians, and I know we need to move beyond data, but more importantly, there's no way for me to connect to minority librarians because nobody was collecting any information about them, I was really shocked. I thought I should use this gap and do something, and with colleagues that were very helpful, we initiated VIMLOC, or Visible Minority Librarians of Canada, together, which still exists. I also try to tie my research to my professional practice, and so I engaged in many types of research examining BIPOC users or BIPOC employees in the library. Through this continued engagement in BIPOC and EDI-related work in librarianship, I was recently appointed as the Visiting Program Officer for CALS Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. I think it's the first time CARL has had something like this. through this work, I'm hoping to do some national level work on EDI in librarianship. I'm also an EDI champion on campus, and I've been working and participating on many EDI initiatives. And I hope to continue my work through all of these initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Maha. So now we are moving on to our prepared questions. I'll ask these questions out loud, and they'll also be on the slides. I'll call on each panelist to answer the question in this order: Ashley, Norda, David, and Maha. Don't feel rushed to answer the questions. We want to make sure this conversation is as organic as possible, and you're encouraged to respond to other panelists. Now to the questions, and they will be on the slides. Question 1. In the context of academic libraries and the broader LIS, what does anti-racist work mean to you? Ashley?
Thanks, David. This is a really big question. I think anti-racist work in terms of LIS scholarship, and I want to make it really clear right now, when I talk about LIS work or librarianship, I am including our library technicians and library assistants in that role, because they're often very involved in this work as well. And I spent a decade as a library technician. And so it's really important for me to bring everyone into this conversation. And I think when we're talking about anti-racist work in academic libraries, there's no way to look at it without realizing that we need a lot of change. And that's going to be change in how we do our work, in the languages the language we're using when we think about classification. And in particular, as a recent graduate, I think we need a lot of change in our programs, both at the master's and the paraprofessional level. And we need to move away from the notion that libraries are a neutral space, because they're not, particularly in the context of Indigenous peoples and other peoples. I don't like the word minority, but I guess that's kind of where I'm at right now this morning, and nothing else is coming to mind. But other peoples of color who, when we think about the history of libraries, particularly in our context of academic libraries, of who was included, but more importantly, who was excluded from these spaces for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to go into with the Indigenous focus. And the other piece, I'll try to keep this brief so everybody else can answer too, but the other piece I think that often gets missed in our education and in these conversations is recognizing that libraries, particularly academic libraries, as extensions of universities and colleges, are very much a colonial foundation or a colonial institution. They were brought over, they're Western European, and so are the ways that they share and store and describe knowledge. And so we need to expand our thinking to think about, what did that replace? What was already here since time immemorial in the Canadian context about information sharing and practices in education. And this is deeply uncomfortable work, and I realize that for a lot of people. But our education needs to change. In my, I think it was a 501 course, I can't remember the title, but it was like the Intro to Libraries course. I used the same textbook that I used 10 years previously in my library technician, and that book talks about ancient Greece and Western civilization, but it does not talk about libraries in other contexts and information sharing in other cultures. And so we really need to change and reflect on how uplifting those works and those library practices is impacting how we do today.